Yep,
Okay, sorry about that.
no worries. All right, so the first beginning of this recording will be a little tech issues. That's okay. All right, so for those of you who've not met me before, my name is David Chu. I'm one of the pulmonary critical care faculty here, but today we'll be talking about something a little different. We'll be talking about retirement planning and accounts, as the title implies. I'd like to start by just saying, I don't have any financial disclosures here. No matter what you decide to do with this information, it doesn't impact me in any way. I don't earn a commission no matter what you buy. I don't have any financial relationships with any company. This is really, really important anytime you get financial advice. I know I say this at the beginning of every presentation, but I really want to hammer this home because plenty of people will offer their financial advice to you. But you are basically at a war with the financial industry for your money, and they are armed with more information and more resources. And in some ways, you're kind of forced to interact with them. So it really behooves you to really educate yourself about this as much as possible, and always question, similar to if you're evaluating a research study, what is the funding source? What is the reason that they're offering this information for you? I will say that I do this because I think this is an incredibly important topic, and I don't think that we do a great job of teaching people about this during training so that they can be ready for what is going to hit them when they become an attending. And maybe it's just I love the sound of my own voice, but I appreciate everyone that's come here. But despite everything that we're going to talk about today, I will always say, I would really encourage you all to look this up on your own, confirm if what I'm saying is correct or not, and see if it really fits for what you want to accomplish. The other big disclaimer that I throw out there is that personal finance is by definition personal. What I try to really talk about is how to optimize things and how to think through the specific topics that we're talking about today is retirement planning, which is a very, very broad topic, but we're going to try to focus on sort of the financial aspects of it. But depending on your individual situation, you may not want to do the specific plan that I lay out here. There may be certain things that you have to take into account in your life that may sort of change your ability to accomplish some of these things, that may change your priorities. So, the reason, again, it's called personal finance is that it's really up to you to kind of prioritize what is most important to you. My goal here is to provide you the information so that you're able to figure out, after you figure out what's important to you, that you're able to figure out from a financial perspective how to achieve those goals. So, to give you a sense of where we're going with this session, we're going to be talking about how to figure out your financial independence number. Really, how much do you have to save in order to not have to work anymore, and how do you go about figuring that out? I assume if you've joined this presentation, you're doing so because at some point you would like to be able to stop working, although some people would like to work their entire lives. But just because you've hit financial independence doesn't mean you have to retire. It just gives you options. We're going to talk about different tax advantage accounts that are out there, a whole lot of numbers and letters, and hopefully help you make sense of that and what you can use. We're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of traditional and Roth contributions, because many of these accounts come in sort of different flavors, as you may have seen before. And then talk about how you sort of create a plan to figure out how much to save toward retirement each year to make sure that you're hitting your goals and things like that. So I've mentioned a few times sort of the term financial independence here. And so I really try to use that more specifically than just retirement. Financial independence really refers to having enough wealth such that you no longer have to work in order to pay for your expenses, so that you can literally just live off the money that you have saved rather than depending on an income stream from working. It could be passive income streams. We're not really going to talk about that today, that sort of supplement that income from money that you've already saved up and invested. But either way, this gives you a sense of how much you would in theory need to have saved up so that you know that you're ready to retire and can live off of that. This can be equated with retirement, but also think of it as having flexibility. So instead of having to, work full time, once you hit financial independence, you could say, well, I still enjoy my job, but there are aspects of it that I don't really like. So maybe I'll go part-time and get more time to myself so I can focus on things other than work. So hitting that number doesn't mean you have to retire, but it certainly opens up a lot more options if you no longer need to continue to work in order to support your life. So a few questions for everyone that's here today. I'm going to assume the answer to this first question is yes, as I kind of implied before. Otherwise, given the title of the talk, why are you here? The second question is, how much do you think you'll need in today's dollars to be financially independent? If people will just sort of throw out like a few numbers in the chat, like how much do you think you'll need to have saved up in order to retire? See, one person says over 1 million, okay. 1.5. 10 million, we've got 7 figures on the table, or 8 figures actually. 3 Bitcoins.
Depending on what it's worth.
3 Bitcoins. I think what that's like just under 120,000 these days. 4 million, okay. All right, so people have at least maybe thought about this a little bit or just throwing out numbers. In how many years would you like to be financially independent? Now, I know we've got a bit of a range of people on this, so I expect that there'll be very different answers to this. Okay, I'm seeing 30 years. Now, okay, that would be nice. 10 to 15, 15. Okay, so a pretty broad range here. We'll talk about sort of how, because it's these two numbers, it's these two things that you'll kind of have to put together that will help you figure out, like, you know, how close you are to retirement, what's a likely time frame, how much you'll have to save and things like that. So I just wanted to get you kind of thinking about those numbers in your head as we're kind of talking about this. And the real point of this is that if you don't set a specific goal, how will you know if you're on track, right? Like, you know, as soon as hopefully either for those of you who are residents and fellows, if you're already saving for retirement, good on you. You're already a little bit ahead of the curve, I think, as most physicians go. But how do you know when you're attending, like how much to put away toward retirement in order to hit financial independence in say 10 years or versus 30 years? Is that, and to see, is that feasible or not? And so follow that over time and seeing, are you actually hitting that goal? Is it likely that you're actually going to hit that goal given your current savings rate? So the first thing I'll talk about is that there is actually data to help guide you in terms of trying to figure out how much you need to have saved in order to be able to retire. And so what this is actually it's the Trinity study, but basically what they did is they looked and saw like, okay, if I saved a whole bunch of money and I invested it, in this case, in this scenario, they invested basically 50% in broad and basically in the total US stock market, and then 50% in a total bond market fund or intermediate term government bonds. So basically like a safe bond fund. And they said, okay, what is the maximum percentage each year that what is the maximum percentage that I can withdraw from that amount each year and not run out of money at the end of 30 years? And they did it for different 30-year rolling time frames. So for example, the data for here, it would be if you started withdrawing in 1980 and had to have it last until 2010, which was the extent of data that they had. Here's if you started in 1925 and then ultimately only needed for 30 years, so through 1955. And you can see for each of these rolling 30-year periods that that percentage was very different. But the maximum amount that the maximum percentage that you could withdraw across all available periods that they could study and not have your money run out on you in 30 years was 4%. So you could have withdrawn as much as 7% per year if you got lucky and retired in 1925 or 1945, 1950, or you could get really unlucky, try to retire in 1965 where really only 4% would have really gotten you by. But when it comes to thinking about how much to save for retirement and how much would be a safe amount, this is where, if you ever hear the 4% rule, this is where it comes from. The idea is that like if you withdraw 4% from your portfolio every year, then the likelihood of you running out of money in 30 years should be hopefully almost nothing. Now, does past performance indicate future results? Not necessarily. Some people talk about now using a 3.5% rule or a 3% rule because people are concerned that returns in the market are going to be less than they have been in the last century. for a number of reasons. But I think it's a good place, at least if you're thinking about how much money you need to have saved for retirement, that you at least have a working number to start with. So what does that mean in terms of how you calculate them? Well, it means that to figure out how much is enough, you have to take how much you spend in a year and multiply that by 25, right? Because if you do that, the number you end up with will be such that you could withdraw 4% of it, which would be 4% of it each year, which would be equal to your current annual spending, and you should be okay. Now, the thing I should mention with this is it's not you're withdrawing like a fixed 4% per year, it's 4% and then you increase it based on inflation. So it's not like you have a portfolio of $100,000, you withdraw, or $1 million and you withdraw $40,000 the first year and you never withdraw more than that each year. This is actually increasing your spending by the amount inflation is going up each year, so that your total spending power is exactly the same each year. So it's not like you're stuck at that one number, because the assumption is that your investments will continue to make returns, hopefully higher than what you're withdrawing. But since, as we talked about in our last talk, the investment returns will go up and down pretty randomly, and we have no way of predicting, it seems like 4% is a safe amount adjusted for inflation each year. So again, if my annual spending here is $40,000 a year, I multiply that by 25, and that tells me that I need $1 million in order to retire and be able to live off of that and be fairly sure that it's not going to run out on me within a 30-year time frame. The thing about this, when you think of the annual spending number to use, is that it's your annual spending during retirement. So unlikely that you're going to have your retirement, you're going to spend the same amount in retirement that you make before retirement, right? Hopefully you'll paid off your mortgage, your student loans, hopefully you'll be well out of the picture, and you won't be trying to save for retirement at the same time. So whatever you've set aside for that, you won't have to think about. So in general, your spending in retirement will usually be less than your spending in your highest earning years. It's unlikely you'll have a pension, unfortunately. A lot of places have moved away from that, and a lot of current pensions have gone bust for various reasons. So you are going to have to probably save most of this yourself at the end of the day. Some people argue that you really shouldn't account for Social Security in this, and I disagree with that. It is too popular a program. Like, no matter, so far, it's really unlikely that it seems like Congress is ever going to actually axe the program entirely. People are concerned that, oh, it's going to run out of money. Well, it will run out of money if they keep the payments the same, but if they, for example, reduce the payments to 75% of what they currently are, the program would remain solvent. So it's likely that something will be done, and there will be Social Security will exist in some form. But there are many things that could happen to it. The repayments could be reduced, it could be means tested, but it's likely to exist in some way. So I think it's reasonable to account for some of your income coming from Social Security. So one way to think about this is that if you say you need, again, $40,000 a year to spend, and $10,000 of that comes from Social Security, well, now the amount that you need to save instead is that your investments only need to provide $30,000 in income. And so you would take 30,000 times 25 rather than 40,000 times 25 to figure out the number that you would have to save. And that's a pretty significant difference. So, you can play around with the calculator on the Social Security website, see what numbers you come up with and what potential likely scenarios are in terms of the payout, and then reduce it by whatever factor you feel is appropriate. And just sort of take that into account as you're trying to think through potential scenarios of how much you need to save. So the second question is that, okay, if we're talking about that we need our annual spending times 25 to figure out the number, then you have to figure out, well, what's your annual spending, right? And so if you don't know what it is, it's time to start tracking. There's a lot of reasons that you really need to do this. One, you should really know sort of where every dollar of yours is going. And two, if you want to figure out if you can retire, the first question you have to answer is, as we just talked about, is what's your annual spending? I actually personally use Mint a lot. I think it's a really easy way to kind of put everything in one place. It's free. Yes, you have to deal with a few ads that come along as you browse the website, but they're fairly unobtrusive. And it's fairly secure. It's Intuit. It's the same people who do TurboTax. So I use it myself. I think it's a good option. For those of you who like to be a little bit more proactive in terms of budgeting and actually sort of making a job for every dollar that you have is kind of their motto. You need a budget, ynab.com. That is not free. You do have to pay an annual fee to use it, but a lot of people have had success with it, and some really like that style of sort of budgeting and tracking. Some people will go so far as just build their own home Excel sheet and just sort of say like, okay, I'm just going to put in numbers here, just sort of track my stuff manually. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but the long and short of it is that I would really encourage you, if you're not already doing it, just have some way of tracking your spending so that at least retrospectively you can look back and say like, okay, where's my money going? Because if later on we figure out the number that you need to save each year is not something that's feasible for you, well, you need to know why. Like, why isn't there money at the end of each month in your account that you can put toward retirement? What are you spending it on? And as it was implying before, costs do change in retirement. Some are actually going to go down. So you're not saving for retirement anymore. Loans, as we talked about, will be paid off. If you have kids, you won't be paying for daycare, because I can tell you it's like another mortgage payment right now. They'll be out of the house. Hopefully college will be done by that point, or not, again, depending on when you're thinking about hitting financial independence. As we talked about in one of my earlier talks, you'll be done with life and disability insurance. Once you're financially independent, you don't need to have life insurance, because if you're no longer there, the money that's left should be enough to sustain whoever was still relying on it. If, for example, you have a spouse that lived with you that was relying on your income. Same thing with disability insurance. If you no longer have to work, you no longer need to carry disability insurance, because you don't need to be able to generate an income anymore. You're able to live off of your investments. You'll also be in a lower tax bracket. So for physicians in general, you will be in a pretty high tax bracket during your highest earning years as an attending. And since your overall costs will likely go down in retirement, you'll actually be in a lower tax bracket, and therefore the amount of tax that you have to worry about in terms of your withdrawals and then how much you have to pay back in taxes will be significantly less than how much you're paying in taxes as an attending. However, there are some things that are likely to go up. Medical expenses, certainly no one has any idea what the hell is going to happen to our medical system. Are we going to go to a single payer system? Are we going to have even more fragmentation of our current system and costs are going to go through the roof? There is absolutely no way of knowing. I think, and currently most of us get our insurance through our employer at a fairly decent discount, at least to us, given the services that we get. It is really unclear how that's going to play out. Now, you will get, and hopefully Medicare will be around, and one would presume it would be, but that'll only work if you're over 65, and who knows if they'll change the age on that, either up or down. And so it's really, really hard to predict that, but you are definitely going to have to set aside far more money for medical expenses than you do currently, most likely. The other thing is that, as we all know as physicians, you will be older, and it will be more likely that you will require additional health care compared to where you are right now. You're probably going to want to travel more or do vacations or activities that are going to cost money. So because you're not working, so you do want to take that into account a little bit. Entertainment's on there, and perhaps you'll have grandkids and you'll want to shower them with gifts that their parents keep telling you, stop giving us gifts. We have too many toys. There's no longer any space in the house. No, this isn't a real situation. I don't know what you're talking about. But anyway. But you may have grandchildren you want to provide for, or help out their parents, or donate to charities. So you want to factor that in a little bit. Estimating retirement needs here, as we kind of just talked about, it's really is an estimate. I think you start at least with sort of what your current annual spending is as an attending, and then sort of see like, okay, how much of this is discretionary spending? How much of this is stuff that's going to go away when I retire? How much of this is stuff that I want to be able to continue? Regardless of how you slice it, it is unlikely you'll need 100% of your current income. So if you're making, say, $200,000 a year as an attending, it is really unlikely you're going to need $200,000 a year in retirement in today's dollars, not accounting for inflation. So most people, a lot of calculators will use 75%. I tend to argue that probably it's closer to 50 or 60%, or maybe even lower. Again, I think the best way to really figure this out is just look at what your actual spending is and see what expenditures are likely to continue when you're retired versus expenditures that are going to go by the wayside that you're currently having to pay for, like childcare and mortgage and so on and so forth. Your financial independence number, as we talked about, spending in retirement per year minus yearly income from other sources. So, we're not really going to touch on this, but say you decide to become a real estate mogul and you own a whole bunch of rental properties that are providing passive income. Now, mind you, rentals are not sort of totally passive. You actually have to manage them, but that's a whole different talk. But say you have passive income streams from, some patent that you came up with or something like that. So you can subtract that from how much you actually need your investments to provide, right? So the same thing from other sources. That includes Social Security, as we talked about. So you take how much spending you think you're going to need in retirement per year, subtract your yearly income from other sources, multiply that from 20 by 25, and that is going to really tell you sort of what your financial independence number is. Now, okay, you're going to put that number out there and it's going to sound like that's a lot of money, right? Like, because as we said, if you wanted to spend $40,000 a year in retirement and adjust that upward for inflation, you're going to have to save $1 million in today's dollars to be able to retire. And I imagine most people in this chat probably would like to be able to spend more than the equivalent of $40,000 a year. So the thing is that, like, when you're before you get to retirement, when you're an attending, you suddenly have this huge paycheck. It's going to completely dwarf your paycheck as a resident or fellow, and you're going to feel like you have a ton of money at the time. And so you're going to say, oh man, I'm going to be able to go and buy that nice sports car, maybe buy a mansion out in the hills, and I don't think my kids are, and I think my kids are too good for public schools. I'm going to send them to the best private schools in the country, and so on and so forth. But the thing is that there's a lot of costs to this. And the reason I bring this up in a retirement talk is, as you'll see, so say you make $250,000 a year. And so that's after tax, using various calculators out there. Let's say that brings you to about $15,000 a month in take-home pay. Let's say you run through that calculation we talked about before and you say, okay, I want to be able to spend $160,000 a year in today's dollars in retirement. So what that means is that in today's dollars, you'd need $4 million saved, because 4% of 4 million is 160,000. And you're hoping to retire after 30 years of working. So what does that mean? At 6% real growth, it turns out you're going to have to save about $4,200 a month. Okay, so if your take home is $15,000, saving $4,200 a month is not the worst thing in the world, but it's a pretty big chunk, right? So it's almost a third of it. But say you went through with all of those purchases that you were thinking of. So if you got that big house, and we'll not even talk about a crazy mortgage, we'll say $750,000 at 4.5% at a 30-year fixed mortgage, that's going to cost you about $4,000 a month to pay for that mortgage for 30 years. If you got that fancy car and you finance 90% of it, you're going to be paying $1,600 a month to pay off that car loan over 5 years. You pay for daycare or private school. If I can tell you right now, if you have 2 kids in daycare, $2,500 a month is pretty reasonable. And if you decide instead that you wanted a nanny, you're looking at like $3,000 or $4,000 a month, depending. So that's got to be part of your budget too. As we talked about a few talks ago, life and disability insurance really are kind of mandatory at that point if you've got people that depend on your income. And so you're spending money to keep those policies in force, and we'll say that's about $500 a month. And on top of this, you've got student loan payments that you're still trying to pay off. And so, we'll say we're going to try to make minimum payments on it for 10 years and then be done with it. And so we're spending $2,100 a month on just paying off our student loans, and that's going to be there for another 10 years. So before anything else, we're already spending $10,700 a month, which leaves me after on a $250,000 a year salary with about $4,587 left to spend on everything else. As we talked about, if I wanted to retire in 30 years with that level of spending, I'm going to have to save $4,200 of that, which means I'm only going to have like $387 left to spend on, everything else, utilities, groceries, hope you'd like to go out, I presume at some point. And so you quickly realize that because you've already spoken for so much money financing your lifestyle with all these debts that you've taken on, these large purchases, all of a sudden you really can't save the amount that you need in order to retire within a 30-year time span for the spending target that you want. So there's a real connection between how much you spend and how quickly you can retire. So every dollar that you're spending right now, if that's going to lifestyle inflation, is a more permanent spending increase. It means the less that you can save right now and the longer a time frame you're looking at till you can retire, or the less that you can spend in retirement. And so, I think ultimately the time frame's up to you, and the goal is up to you. As we talked about, personal finance is personal. So, say spending $120,000 a year in today's dollars is fine, and you're willing to adjust down that number, and you're still willing to aim for a 30-year time frame, then fine. If you can, as long as you can hit your goal, you can take on some of those big purchases and financing those loans. But if you're telling me like I want to retire in 10 or 15 years, like you're going to have to save a lot more than $4,200 a month to hit any sort of reasonable financial independence number in that time frame. And so you're going to have to take a hard look at your large purchases and say, like, is this something that's worth it? Because this getting that large house and that fancy car now functionally means that you are going to take longer before you can retire. And so people talk about this as sort of the hedonic treadmill, where it just feels like, you get something new and shiny and you're happy for a bit, and then you get that burst of happiness, and then it sort of becomes your new baseline. And so you start spending more, and it's really easy to get into this cycle that you just start making larger and larger purchases. I think one of the biggest pieces of advice that I tell people is that you really don't want to grow into your income all at once. So when you become an attending, realize that you're used to spending on a residence or fellow salary. Like, you shouldn't up your lifestyle. I'm not saying you should. I'm not saying you shouldn't up it at all. I think spending a little bit more is fine, but take that additional money and start putting it toward those big goals. Really map out a plan for you to make sure that you're going to hit your goals with respect to being able to hit financial independence in the time frame that you want, that you're going to be able to hit savings goals, for example, for your kids, if you want to save for them to go to college, or you do want that fancy car, but you don't want to have to take out a loan. You want to be able to buy it mostly in cash. Then you want to be able to save that money and not have to take on additional debt. Or you have large student loans and you need to get rid of them, and that's fine. Focus on that, get rid of them first, and then take the money that you're no longer having to use to pay the interest on that loan and put it toward larger purchases. So, again, this comes down to what you think is important. Figure out what your goals are, but now that you can hopefully figure out what your financial independence number is, keep that in mind as to how much you're going to have to use that to figure out how much you're going to have to save each month to just be able to retire in the time frame that you want. So how much is enough? Set a goal and run the numbers. Again, no wrong answer. The way that I typically do this is that I'll sort of say that I'll use an investment calculator. This is the one that I most commonly use that I've linked up there. If you just search for investment calculator, it's the bank rate one. But basically what you do is you'd say that, okay, I want to hit, you figure out your financial independence number, and you put up there, here, I'll tell you what, it's probably easiest if I actually just show you. So hopefully this works the way that I intend. Let's see. Okay, so hopefully you all see that. So say my financial independence number was 4 million, right? So we'll put 4 million as our investment goal. We'll say we don't have anything saved now, and we want to get there in 15 years. Now, I tend to use a 4% rate of return. The reason I do this is if you expect your investments to return 7% per year and inflation is 3% per year, subtract your nominal returns, subtract inflation from your nominal return, so 7% minus inflation, which on average is around 3% per year, and you get a real rate of return of about 4%. The reason I do this is now I don't have to adjust for inflation in terms of my financial independence number. It's already baked in. So I don't have to adjust how much I save. I don't have to adjust the final number. I can just see if using this assumption, will I hit this number in this time frame? So let's say I think I can save $5,000 a month toward retirement, and I want to get there in 15 years. Am I going to get there? The answer is no. I'm going to be nowhere near it. I'm only going to have saved 1.2 million in that time frame. So I will be nowhere near that 4 million number. Well, let's say, and what if I extend my time frame to 25 years? How will it look then? Well, now I'm at 2.5 million, which is looking a little bit better, but unfortunately still well below my goal. So now I'm going to say, okay, well, what if I save 10,000 a month? How does that look? In a 25-year time frame, I'm actually going to be able to blow right by it. So let's say if I can save 10,000 a month, could I potentially retire earlier? Looks like I could do it in somewhere between 21 to 22 years. And so that's how I generally sort of run the numbers here. I would put my number up here. You don't have to. You can just look at sort of the number you get here. I use a 4% rate of return, but you could also run other assumptions. Say you're wrong and the real rate of return on investments is actually 5% per year. That's going to change pretty dramatically the time frame and how much you have to save as well. So you can kind of run different scenarios here and see, you know, what you think is sort of a reasonable amount that you can save. And then based on that, like how long it's going to take you to get to your financial independence number. And if you need to potentially either up your savings or up your duration, how long you work before you retire. All right, so back to that. There we are. All right, so if you're unsure about this and this all seems really complicated, trust me, I get it. If you're not sure, just start with 20% of your gross take-home pay. So if you're making $200,000 a year, what I would recommend as a starting point for this is saving at least $40,000 a year toward retirement. The reason that I'm using 20%, those of you who have done a little bit of reading on this more generally, you might see numbers of like 5, 10% or 15% thrown out there. You have to realize that we're starting at a disadvantage as physicians. If you're waiting till you're an attending to start saving for retirement, you know, and you're already like in your late 20s, early 30s, you're already sort of behind your peers, where if they started saving like, you know, right after they finished high school or college, you know, that extra 6 years, say they can work till age 60, you know, that extra 6 years that they get on you really does make a big difference, as you saw, as we were kind of running numbers there in terms of numbers because of how compound interest works. So, you know, my general rule of thumb, which I will admit I completely steal from the White Coat Investor, is that if you're unsure, start with 20%, but then you can throw it into the calculator and say like, okay, well, if I save 20% of my income per year and I save it for this number of years, how much am I going to end up with at the end of the day? So you can see if that's reasonable or not, if that's a reasonable goal for you to hit, and then adjust as needed. But again, remember, this is whatever you're saving here goes into your budget. But in addition to that, the things that are going to be mandatory in your budget are going to be loan payments, payments on your mortgage, and other sort of required debt payments that you're going to have to make. So it's all about figuring out what budget is reasonable for you, and are you going to be able to hit your goals within that budget, and adjusting things around as needed. All right, so let me stop there because we're going to shift gears and now talk more about investment or retirement accounts and sort of tax advantage stuff and whatnot. Any questions about how to figure out your financial independence number and how to sort of work through different potential savings scenarios and whether they'll work for you? Okay, so one question, you hear that one of the ways families build wealth is with home ownership. Should that factor in at all? So my short take on home ownership is that you should buy a house if you want a house because you want a house. You should not buy a house as an investment vehicle unless you're buying, like, you know, unless you're investing in real estate for other reasons. When you compare the return, on average, the returns on buying a house are basically just keep up with inflation. It's around 3%. Compare that to investing in broad-based index funds, which are usually like 7 or 8%, and the returns on the S&P 500, like the 500 largest stocks in the US, if you just invested in an index fund of that, over the last century have been 10% per year, actually. So actually, there are better ways to get a better return on your money compared to buying a house. So the other thing is that house returns are very dependent on factors that you have no control over, like, what happens to the school districts in your area, or, like we have to think about around here, apparently, that sinkholes are a thing, and maybe a sinkhole comes open and swallows your household. So there's a lot of concentrated risk there. So, unlike investing in a large broad-based US total stock market index fund, where, if any one company goes under, who cares? Because there's a whole bunch of other companies that are probably going to do well. And on aggregate, it seems like they do well. If one bad event happens to your house, you could just be screwed. And so it's a lot of concentrated risk. Like if just one thing happens to that, it can be really ruinous, which is why we carry homeowners insurance. But it's not. There are better ways to make a larger return on your money in a relatively easy manner. One of the big reasons that homeownership gets touted as a way to kind of build wealth is that it's forced savings, right? So you're paying for a mortgage, and if you pay off the mortgage, then you own the house. So you're forced to make these payments each month toward the value of the house until you ultimately own it. And so it's true, it's basically like putting money into the house. And the reason that it helps a lot of people is because they're not disciplined about being able to save enough for retirement otherwise. And so it's kind of a way to force people to save. So I don't think that, my general take, at least, is that I don't look at a house as an investment vehicle. I look at a house as a consumption item, that I'm buying it because I want a house to live in, because you could, in theory, also rent. You just have to it's just that over time, the price of rent increases, the price of a mortgage doesn't. And so in the long run, because inflation is the thing, the debt that you own on the house is less. You pay for it with less valuable dollars. And at the end of it, you actually own the house. And great of you if you were a handy person and have the time. Yes, absolutely true, Ted. Just wondering how to factor in the equity in retirement. The savings analogy makes sense. Yeah. Some people, there are a lot of different ways to do it. Some people look at it as basically like a bond of sorts, that if you include the equity as part of your portfolio, and that it should be part of the bond part of your portfolio, and then if you own the house, then you have that equity. I don't tend to think of it as part of my portfolio, and my rationale for that is that if I were to sell the house, I then have to find a new place to live. So ultimately, I think of it as like a consumption. I think of it purely as a consumption line item, not as a net worth item. Although in theory you can sell the house and get that money, but the problem is then now you're going to accrue a new expense on the expense side of your account, saying that you now need to pay for housing in a different form rather than just living in the house that you own. If that makes sense. All right, other questions? All right. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually had a question. So is there any way, I guess, if at all, that you can insulate yourself at all from stock market, 2008 type events, basically? I mean, that's the biggest thing that I would worry about, as far as, do you need to, after you have a certain amount of gains, do you move it to some place to protect it from, I guess, that kind of stuff? I guess that was kind of my question. I don't know.
Sure. So, what you're getting at is that the reason that we invest in the market, and this is sort of going into the last talk a little bit, is that the long-term returns are very good, but there's a lot of risk involved in the day-to-day, right? As you mentioned, you don't know when the next 2008 crash is going to happen, or the 2000 .com bubble is going to happen, right? There's just zero way of predicting that. And so the thing is that like when you're young and your runway is 15, 20 years, who the hell cares what happens in the next 5 or 10 years, right? You're still going to be saving regardless, and the market's going to be allowed a lot of time to recover because you're not going to be touching that money for a long period of time. So when this really goes into portfolio allocation. And so in the beginning of your investing career, most of your portfolio should be in stocks because they're going to have a higher rate of return. So you can just invest in like a US total market index, an international total market index, and have only a little money in a bond fund because you can tolerate a lot of volatility. You don't care if the market goes down 50% tomorrow, because by the time you retire in 25 years, that's going to be a tiny blip overall in your total investing and your overall returns. But when you get closer to retirement, you can't handle as much volatility because all of a sudden you now are going to be starting to draw down those funds, right? And so at that point, since your risk tolerance is different, your allocation should be different. So instead of like right now, like for example, my allocation is like 90% stocks divided like US market and international market, and then 10% bonds. As I get closer, what I'm targeting right now for retirement is probably closer to 60-40 or 50-50. Right? So that's why they use 50-50 in the Trinity study, an allocation of 50% stocks, 50% bonds, is because for someone who's actually retired, you have a larger portion of your funds, of your money in sort of safer investments like bonds and such that aren't going to be subject to as much volatility. So that's that would be how you shield yourself from it. Now, does that mean you're reducing your potential long-term returns? Yes, but that's kind of necessary because you don't want to be forced to sell a lot of those stock holdings at a loss during retirement. So you have a larger portion that's in safer investments. Yeah, so basically it's all of investing is about like allocation. It's about like where you put your money and how much you have in one bucket versus another. So, since there are different risk amounts, which I think since we're going to talk about, we're not going to talk about so much in this talk, but it's about really sort of allocation based on risk tolerance and time to retirement. Your risk tolerance is high when you're young and you've got a 25-year runway. Your risk tolerance is much lower when you're about to retire, no longer making additional money, and are now going to have to live off of that. So you decrease your risk by decreasing your exposure to risky assets like the stock market. You still need some of that because you still need to generate a reasonable return on your total investment, but you have a larger allocation in bonds or similar safe investments so that you don't see as much volatility, and you can ride out the volatility in your stocks. If the market does happen to crash 50%, well, now you're just going to be primarily drawing from the bond portion of your portfolio instead. So now that we're talking about sort of investments and we're not talking today so much about what to invest in. That was the last talk. Today, we're going to talk more about where to actually do that investing, what accounts to actually do that in. And so retirement accounts are this huge alphabet soup of things, unfortunately. You've got 401k plans, 403b, 457b. There's self-employed plans like individual solo 401ks, SEP IRAs, simple IRAs, defined benefit contribution plans, IRAs, and HSAs. So it gets very complicated very quickly, but I'm going to try to break this down a bit. But if there are questions that pop up here, please just throw them in the chat or get my attention. I'm happy to sort of go more in depth on any of these. So why even think about this at all? Why not just open an account at Vanguard or Charles Schwab or Fidelity and just throw my money into a normal taxable account? Well, the thing is that taxes actually are a pretty big deal in terms of your total investment return. So if you think about it, when you put an investment in stocks, some of the money that you make is going to be on appreciation of the stock, that the value of those stocks increases, but some of that return is the dividends that they pay out, right? So say you own Apple, then I don't know if Apple actually gives a dividend anymore, but anyway, say they did, and it's like 2% of the value of the stock. Well, for tax purposes, it's like you've made that additional money is counted as income. It may be counted as qualified dividends, so it'll be taxed a little bit less, but it will be taxed nevertheless. Part of the point of tax advantaged accounts is that if that dividend gets spun off inside that account, it doesn't get taxed at the time. And so because that goes into the overall growth, and then that dividend would, in theory, should get reinvested, like you're increasing the rate of return on your investment by not having to pay taxes on those dividends over time. So by avoiding this tax drag, you ultimately make more money in the long run. There's also a lot of asset protection that comes with this, right? And in most states, your 401k, 403bs, IRAs, all that is not accessible to would-be lawsuits. If someone sues you for whatever reason, and they try to take all of your assets, your retirement accounts are generally safe from that. That may vary from state, that does vary from state to state, but in many cases, they would be completely ignored. Tax arbitrage is another thing. So in your highest earning years, you're going to be in the highest tax brackets, right? You may be in the 32%, 34, 37%, and so on. But if your spending goes down, so you're needing to withdraw less in retirement, that means that you may be saving at a higher marginal rate, like that 37% rate. But when you withdraw, you're only going to have to pay taxes at a 10 or 12% rate, depending on how much you're withdrawing per year. And so you're saving money in that respect as well. All right, so there's the reason to do it. So let's get into what all these sort of numbers and letters mean. Fundamentally, all of these things are just places to put money and investments. Like, it is just a place to put things in. And so inside a 401k or 403b is where you invest your money. And you invest in stocks within the 401k account, or you invest in bonds in the 401k account, or an IRA, or an HSA. Like, they're just different types of accounts. Having a 401k doesn't mean you're investing. Putting money into it, it doesn't mean you're investing. Putting the money inside an account into an investment vehicle like an index fund is how you invest it, okay? So what about sort of traditional versus Roth contributions, right? So for example, at Penn State, it's a nonprofit, so instead of a 401k, it's a 403b. But those of you who are either using it already or who have looked into it here, you may have noticed you had the option to make traditional contributions or Roth contributions. So let's take a second to say what that actually means. A traditional contribution versus Roth contribution primarily just means when you pay taxes on that contribution. So if you weren't investing in a tax advantaged account, if you were just investing in a taxable account, then the contributions you put in before, when you get paid, you have to pay income taxes on that, right? So before you can, in theory, invest any of that money that you've just made from working, you have to pay taxes on that money. As it's growing, as we talked about, if it's spinning out dividends, then you're going to have to pay taxes on those dividends, which might be capital gains taxes, or if it's short-term capital gains or non-qualified, they would actually be taxed at the same rate as your regular income. And then when you go to sell those, investments, you have to again pay capital gains tax on it. So you actually get taxed a few times if you want to make an investment in just a standard taxable account. In a traditional account, the savings comes up front. So instead of having to pay money on those taxes on those contributions, so say you make $200,000 and you contribute $10,000 to a traditional 403b, then that $10,000 is actually subtracted from your taxable income for federal tax purposes. It doesn't affect state and local taxes, but for federal tax purposes, which is by far the largest bite out of it, it basically gets ignored. So for federal tax purposes, it's as if you only made $190,000 that year instead of $200,000 with a $10,000 traditional 403b contribution. During growth, because it's a tax advantaged account, any dividends that get spit out get completely ignored for tax purposes. So you're not paying taxes on those dividends. And then when you withdraw it, the federal government ultimately needs to gets its share. And so how it does it is that when you withdraw from that account, it's as if you are making that amount of money. And so it's taxed as ordinary income tax at ordinary income tax rate. So you save money going in, you don't have to pay taxes on the amount that you put in there, you save on the growth, but what the government always has to get its share. And so when you withdraw from that account, it's as if you added that money it's as if you made that much money for income tax purposes. So if I withdrew 10,000, I'd have to pay taxes. It's as if I made $10,000 more that year. Roth contributions basically do the opposite thing as traditional contributions. So say I made a $10,000 contribution to a Roth 403b. What happens is that for tax purposes, in the year I make the contribution, if I make $200,000 and I contribute $10,000 to a Roth 403b, for federal tax purposes for that year, I'm still making $200,000. It doesn't get subtracted. So I'm still, in theory, paying taxes on that money before it goes in there. Same thing as any other tax advantaged account. It gets any dividends, any stuff that gets sort of spit out in there gets ignored for tax purposes. So again, you're avoiding tax drag. But then finally, when you go to withdraw it, since you already paid taxes on the money before it went in there, all the gains that you made, all the dividends that you don't have to pay any more taxes on it. So the advantage to Roth contributions is that you're paying taxes now so that you don't have to pay taxes later, okay? HSAs are a little bit unique. We don't have access to one here, so I'll just be very brief about it. But in case you do, it gets paired with a high deductible health plan. But the idea behind HSAs is that you can use them paired with a high deductible healthcare plan insurance to pay for health expenditures. To be able to make this sort of useful, if you put money in there, you don't pay taxes on it. So again, you make 200,000, you contribute 10,000 to an HSA, which you can't in 1 year, but anyway, it's as if you made $190,000 that year for federal tax purposes. Again, it's a tax advantaged account, so it gets ignored. Any dividends or anything like that that occurs in the account get ignored. If you use it for healthcare expenses, when you withdraw the money from there, it actually also doesn't get taxed. So it's the only triple tax advantaged account that exists. You don't pay money. You don't pay taxes on money going in, you don't pay taxes on growth, and if you use it for healthcare expenditures, you actually don't pay taxes on withdrawals either, which is great. If you hold the money in there to age 65, then actually you can withdraw money from there at ordinary income tax rate. So in other words, if you use it for purchases after age 65 that aren't related to healthcare, then it acts exactly like a traditional tax advantaged account. So what it really comes down to, one of the things to think about then is like, how do I decide when to make traditional or Roth contributions? Think about it as when you put money in there, you're saving at your marginal tax rate, and when you withdraw money, the tax amount is at your overall rate. So what do I mean by that? This is actually these are actually the tax brackets from last year, but anyway, if you have, so say that you're making $250,000 a year and you're filing as a single filer. That means that you're in the 35% tax bracket. But let's say you saved $10,000 into a traditional tax advantaged account. Since that money falls within the 35% bracket, I actually save at a 35% rate. So if I put $10,000 into a traditional tax advantaged account, then I actually end up saving $3,500 in taxes that year compared to if I didn't make that contribution to a traditional account. When I go to withdraw it though, we have to start because it's a marginal tax system, you have to start from the bottom and work your way back up, right? So if I withdraw 10,000, the first 10,000 I withdraw is going to be taxed at 10%. The next 30,000 I withdraw is going to be taxed at 12%. So you can see that it's pretty easy to have a winning combination if you're saving at a higher marginal rate and you're withdrawing and having to pay taxes at a much lower tax rate. So what does that mean about deciding when to make Roth versus traditional contributions when you get the option? If your current marginal rate is high and your future marginal rate is low, you want traditional contributions. If the opposite is the case, your marginal rate's low and your future marginal rate's likely to be higher, you want to make Roth contributions. The nice thing about being in medicine is actually it should make it fairly easy to figure out when you should be making either of these. If you're a resident or fellow and you're saving toward retirement, you're probably going to be spending more in retirement than you're currently making. And so really you're probably best making Roth contributions, paying taxes now at a low marginal rate, and then saving on taxes in the future. Versus when you're an attending and you're likely to be in a higher tax bracket because you're making more each year than you're planning to spend in retirement, then you want the tax savings now and plan to withdraw at a much lower rate when you get to retirement. Now, does this take into account what's going to happen to the tax code? Our marginal rate's going to go up over time because they're really at historical lows? No, but there's really no way to kind of predict that. And so my general recommendation is that as a resident, make Roth make Roth contributions if you can. As an attending, you probably want to favor traditional contributions. And you probably want to have a little bit in both types of accounts. The way that most people do this is that they'll use their workplace plan as a 401k, 403b, depending as a traditional, and make traditional contributions to that. And since as an attending, your income will be too high to make Roth IRA contribution, to make traditional IRA contributions and deduct them, you will make Roth IRA contributions. So traditional workplace contributions, either a 401k or 403b, and Roth IRA contributions. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit later, but it does ensure at least that you have some money in sort of both, so you can decide actually how much to withdraw from a Roth account versus how much to withdraw from a traditional account, depending on what the tax situation looks like in the future. And again, you know, this is sort of a screenshot from the calculator I showed you before, but you may have noticed that there's a tax deferred number and a taxable number. The reason that these two numbers exist is that this is the effective tax drag. So this is the effect of trying to save $4,000 a month at a 6% rate over 30 years. That it's an over $1 million difference between saving in tax advantaged accounts, saving $4,000 a month at 6% rate growth, versus saving it all in taxable accounts. So this really should hopefully hammer home that you really should be trying to max out your tax advantage accounts at every opportunity, because they're all use it or lose it, right? So whatever the contribution limit is for that year, if you don't hit it, and then next year you have more money that you can contribute, you can't go back and backfill like the money you didn't fill up that account with the prior year. You're stuck with whatever the limit is for that year, for as much as you can contribute in that year. Okay. So questions about Roth versus traditional contributions. Okay, so now we're going to talk about these individual accounts and some of their quirks. So they're the employer-based plans for certainly all the residents and fellows that are on here, and all the faculty that work here, we're all W-2 employees. So like it's tax time, I certainly got my W-2 recently. So if you get your income information on W-2, you're an employee, and these are the accounts that you're probably looking at. 401k and 403bs are the main sort of workplace-based accounts. They're named for the section of the tax code that they're filed under. The only major difference between a 401k and 403b is just 401ks are associated most often with for-profit institutions. 403bs are something that really only exist at nonprofit institutions, but functionally they're basically the same thing. The maximum employee contribution per year has not changed since last year. It is $19,500 per year. Again, you can make traditional or Roth contributions. You could actually sort of, if you wanted to, for whatever reason, make some Roth, some traditional, but as long as the total amount of contributions across both types is no more than $19,500. So say you made like $19,500 in traditional contributions, you can't make another $19,500 in Roth contributions. It's the sum total that has to equal $19,500. And it's across all 401k accounts and 403b accounts. So say you had you worked for two employers and they each had their own workplace plans. You can't do $19,500 at one employer and $19,500 at another employer. It would have to be a sum total of $19,000 across both employers. The maximal annual contribution that the employer can add to it, plus the employee contributions, up to $57,000 a year. And so a lot of employers will offer matches. Unfortunately, as a resident or fellow here, there are no matching funds that are given to you. But if you do work, once you become an attending, if they do offer matching funds at your workplace, those matching funds are always traditional. You do not have the option to receive those matched funds as Roth contributions. So just keep that in mind for tax purposes. When you go to withdraw it down the line, you will have to pay taxes on it. The thing about these plans is that the investments in them are limited to whatever the plan has available. So you really don't have a lot of say. You just kind of have to choose within there, like what investments are available. Fortunately here, the investments are quite good. You have access to very low cost index funds. And so our plan's reasonable, but there are plenty of employers that have plans that really suck. It's less common for large hospitals. Usually it's much smaller groups or people who haven't sort of taken the time or energy to figure out how to manage these things that you deal with, like high expense ratios and whatnot. But you can sometimes get stuck with a bad employer sponsored plan where all your investment options are all like actively managed funds that with high expense ratios. The other thing is that, so say you go from one employer and then you go and you work for one place, you save in their 401k account, and then you go to another, the funds can be rolled over or they can potentially be kept there until you're ready to withdraw them in retirement. But they can be rolled over either to another 401k or 403b plan or to an IRA. So they're not forced to be stuck there, but if you like the investments you have available in your old employer's plan and you don't like the ones in your new plan, you're not forced to move the money usually. It depends on the individual rules, but many places will just let you keep it there. And if you don't like it, if you do like the choices in your new employer's plan, you can just roll the funds over and reinvest them in those. There's no tax burden that occurs from doing these rollovers. It's all basically ignored for federal tax purposes. The caveat to this is that these are meant for retirement, and so to encourage that, you can't pull money out there until age 59 and a half without a penalty. So if you say you're 50, you retire and you're like, I want to start pulling money from this a little bit earlier, not only are you going to have to pay ordinary income taxes on that, you're also going to have to pay, I think it's like a 10% additional penalty tax on the amount that you withdraw for the privilege of withdrawing it early. So keep in mind that if you're looking at like an early retirement scenario, that you may not be able to get access to this money as early as you'd like, although there are ways if you roll it over to an IRA to do so. The other thing is check your plan carefully for fees. By law, all the fees have to be very readily stated by the plan sponsor. So you should be able to see, is there an account management fee that you have to pay? Are there other fees that may be eating into your returns? So that's the 401k or 403b is probably the most common one that you will see. The 457b plan is actually another relatively common one that many physicians will see. We actually have a non-governmental one here, which I'll talk about how it differs in a little bit. But if you work for a government entity or like state or federal, you may get access to this. And so if it's a governmental 457b plan, the rules are basically exactly the same as a 403b plan. That maximum contribution limit is the same per year. You can only make traditional contributions to this. You do not have the option of making Roth contributions to a 457b plan. The big difference is that there's no minimum age for withdrawal. So if you were thinking sort of early retirement, then perhaps you would actually consider doing and the investments were good, you would actually potentially consider making contributions to the 457b plan first and filling that up before you start filling up the 403b. If the fund options are good, it's maybe better than a 403b. I did get a question, can you roll over or transfer contributions from a 401k or 403b into a backdoor IRA? So I don't, there is a way to do it. It depends on the plan, the 403b or 401k plan having very specific things available to you, which you have to be able to make what are called after-tax contributions. And so what I mean by that is that so the maximum employee contribution is $19,500 per year. The total contribution per year is no higher than 57. So say you get matched like $10,000. So then the total contribution so far is $29,500. If the plan allows after-tax contributions, you can actually contribute yourself up to the maximum $57,000 a year if you wanted, but you're not going to get any tax advantage to that, meaning that it'll be treated as if, the money going in gets taxed, right? So the only reason that you'd want to do that is if the plan also allows what are called in-service rollovers, meaning that while you're still with the employer, you're allowed to roll the money from that 401k or 403b account into another account. Because if they do that, then you can take those after-tax contributions and actually roll them over to a Roth IRA. This gets termed the mega backdoor IRA because it allows you to make massive Roth IRA contributions that you really can't make otherwise. Many plans don't have those two sort of things about it, that they don't allow after-tax contributions, and they don't allow in-service rollovers, because if they don't offer both those things, you can't do it. But I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but in general, that's the only way you'd sort of do a backdoor IRA contribution, is if you're making after-tax contributions to the 401k. Typically, it's a 401k. I don't think 403b plans in general you can do this with. So contributions above the 19,500 that you don't initially get any tax savings on, but you can roll over to a Roth IRA. If you can do after-tax contributions and roll them over to a Roth in-service rollovers, then you can roll them to a Roth IRA and then have that as Roth money rather than just sort of after-tax money, which I wouldn't recommend doing. It's a weird situation where basically you pay taxes on the money going in, you don't have to pay taxes on growth, but then you also pay ordinary income taxes on the way out. So you're actually better off paying long-term capital gains taxes in that scenario, because long-term capital gains taxes are probably going to be lower than ordinary income taxes on those withdrawals. So I would only do after-tax contributions if you had the option of actually rolling it over to a Roth IRA later. So sorry, that's far more complicated than I planned. Hopefully that answers your question. Anyway, so 457 governmental 457Bs, we talked about. Non-governmental 457B plans start out the same as other 457B plans. Contribution limits the same. You can only make traditional contributions. You can't do Roth contributions. The problem is that unlike a 401k, 403b, or 457b, if the company goes under, it doesn't matter. Like that money is not owned by the company. The money still is owned by you and the plan sponsor. So you don't have to worry about anything happening to it. With a non-governmental 457b plan, that money is actually still technically owned by the employer. So what I mean by a credit risk is that if your employer goes under and goes bankrupt and there are creditors demanding to be paid, you're actually lower in priority than to get the money that's in your 457B plan than those people who the company you work for owe, that are the people that your company owes money to are. So there is a possibility that the money that you have in there could no longer be yours if the place that you're working for goes under. So there is a real risk there. Now, it depends on who your employer is. As I mentioned, Penn State has a non-governmental 457B plan, and I'll fully admit that I use it because I think the credit risk of Penn State going under is pretty low, fortunately. But it's certainly not zero. I mean, we all saw Hahnemann go under 2 years ago, so the risk is definitely not zero. The other thing that's weird about it is that it can't be rolled over to another. It can't be rolled over to an IRA or a 401k or 403b if you leave that employer. It can only be rolled over to another non-governmental 457b plan, and only if the new plan allows it. Like, other plans are not required to accept rollovers from another plan's 457b plan. So you could end up in the situation where you've saved a whole bunch of money and you've saved on taxes up to that point, and now that you leave that employer, you're forced to withdraw that money all at once. And now it's as if you suddenly, so say you had like 200,000 in the account. When you leave, when you withdraw it, it's as if you made another $200,000 that year. And now you're going to be paying it at most likely at the highest marginal rates at like 35, 37%. So it may be that you end up actually losing money in the deal, depending on how much money was there before you left the company, if you're still working. Your withdrawal options may be limited. After you leave the employer, they may say, like, okay, you have to take it all as one large sum, or you have to take it over 5 years. They don't have to be quite as stringent about reporting all of the fees that are potentially associated with the plan. So you have to do a lot of research, is basically the bottom line. If you have a non-governmental 457B plan open to you, it is not a no-brainer like a governmental 457B plan or a 401k or 403B to invest in. So just be careful before you use this. This does merit some research before considering it. All right. So those are probably the most common ones that a lot of people here will run into. For those of you who end up working in the private practice space, potentially become a partner, or work as a 1099, like basically work as a contractor, and you get your tax form instead of a W-2 is reported as a 1099, you will be working with some of these other things, which I'll only touch on very briefly. But A solo 401k or individual 401k is basically a plan that you have to kind of create yourself with. You go through like an investment company like Vanguard or Charles Schwab or TD Ameritrade or whatever, and you have to fill out a lot of paperwork to kind of make this happen. But once you actually create the plan, it essentially functions like a 401. It's essentially functions like an employer-sponsored 401k plan. The thing is that because you're self-employed, you can make contributions as the employee, but also as the employer, which is kind of a fascinating thing because you kind of are working for yourself, right? But they put a limit on how much you put in there. So like you can only put as much in here as an employee as how you make. You can only put as much as an employer depending on your net self-employment income, right? So if you only make like $10,000 a year, but you make like $50,000 a year at another job, you can't put $19,500 into this account because you didn't make it at this job. You made it at a different job. You can make traditional or Roth contributions. Again, similar to matching funds for a 401k or 403b, they are always traditional contributions as the employer contribution. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of paperwork involved in this. SEP IRAs are a slightly simpler way to do this. Basically there's only an employee contribution limit. Again, it's based on how much you make. So if you make $50,000 or you make $40,000 at your job, then you can only contribute up to $10,000, even though the total limit is $57,000, regardless of your income from other sources. This I threw out there just in case it's sort of relevant to anyone. If you're self-employed, approximately 18.58% of net profits up to $57,000. So you have to make a lot as a 1099 to really max this out, but potentially it's a little bit easier to do so. And then IRAs in general, and the reason that you may want to go through the paperwork of getting a solo 401k rather than a SEP IRA. So IRAs are not tied to an employer. These are just accounts that you can open at any financial institution, investing institution, I should say. Contributions, the limit is still $6,000 a year. It's the same as last year. You have the choice of making traditional or Roth contributions like a lot of the other accounts that we've talked about. But there are income limits on your ability to contribute to an IRA. If you want to deduct your contributions, which means that you're making traditional contributions from your federal taxes, your income has to fall below a certain level, which and that income level drops drastically if you have access to a 401k or 403b account. The long and short of it is that most people, even residents and fellows, are going to be above the income limit for being able to deduct traditional contributions to an IRA. So functionally, you're not really going to be able to use it as use a traditional IRA to get additional tax savings. However, most residents and fellows will have the option of doing direct Roth contributions. So, you know, the income limit for being able to make Roth contributions is far higher, and most residents, almost all residents and fellows will fall under that unless your spouse makes a lot of money or you're married filing jointly. As an attending, your income will almost certainly be above the limit for being able to make direct Roth contributions, though. And so what you end up having to do, as I kind of implied before, is this thing called a backdoor Roth IRA, as I'll talk about in just a second. But just to kind of finish out the IRA explanation, you can invest in any stock, bond, or mutual fund that you wish. So unlike those employer-sponsored plans where you're just limited to whatever the employer allows you to invest in, what the plan allows you to invest in, since you open the IRA at whatever financial institution you want, you can also invest in whatever you want. And so this is why IRAs are nice, because you're not limited. You can invest in literally anything out there that you would normally be able to invest in. It just has the tax advantages that an IRA account comes with, as well as the potential legal advantages in bankruptcy. Similar to 401ks and 403bs, you can't pull out money until age 95 and a half without a penalty, which again, the whole point of this account is that they're trying to encourage people to save for retirement, so they don't want you pulling out money early from it. So what's this backdoor Roth IRA? I've alluded to a few times. So how do you use an IRA if you're above the contribution limit for to deduct traditional IRA contributions? So therefore you wouldn't want to do that. But you also can't make Roth contributions because you're over the limit for that. Well, here's what you do. You make a non-deductible contribution to a traditional IRA. So you know you can't deduct it from your federal taxes. So you just put the money in there and you don't get any tax savings. You then have the option to convert that to a Roth IRA, not recharacterize. Recharacterize is basically just telling them that you made a mistake and I didn't mean to make a traditional contribution, I meant to make a Roth contribution. Converting it is actually a separate process. The good news is most sites literally do this in one click now because a lot of people do this. The problem is when you make that conversion, if you have any traditional holdings in any other accounts, there's something called the pro rata rule. So what that essentially means is that if I had $10,000 in traditional IRA holdings and contributed $6,000 that year as a non-deductible contribution, and then I converted that $6,000 to a Roth, for tax purposes, it's like that 10,000 and 6,000 mixed together, and that, let me make the math easier. Okay, let's say I had like 54,000 in traditional contributions and 6,000 in Roth. So, and I want to convert that 6,000 or 6,000 in non-deductible traditional, and I want to convert that 6,000 now to Roth. For tax purposes, as if all that 54,000 and 6,000 kind of mixed together. So it's as if I have, when I pull that 6,000 out, it's going to assume, since 6,000 is 10% of the total 60,000 across all IRA accounts, it's going to assume that 90% of that is from that traditional IRA, which needs to be taxed, and that only 10% of that is that non-deductible contribution and won't be taxed. So 90% of that contribution in that scenario would be taxed. If I had 6,000 in traditional and 6,000 existing account and 6,000 in non-deductible, I did that 6,000 conversion again, I would have to pay taxes on 50% of that conversion, because again, it mixes together. So it assumes that 50% is that pre-tax traditional and 50% is that non-deductible traditional. So the long and short of it is, if you're going to use this, you need to have a balance of 0 in your traditional IRA account at the beginning of the year. Otherwise, it can get really complicated, and you're going to be paying taxes on every time that you do this. Some people were concerned that this was potentially illegal because the sum of all of these steps was technically illegal. Like, you're not allowed to make you're not allowed to make direct contributions to a Roth above a certain income limit. But actually, the most recent tax law that was passed, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, officially made this legal. Why they didn't just say you could just make direct contributions to a Roth IRA regardless of your income, I have no idea. I guess they're just trying to keep TurboTax and HR Block in business is the most likely thing. But yeah, so if you look up backdoor Roth IRA, it will actually take you through the steps of how you do this on Vanguard, on Fidelity, on multiple sites. So if you're interested in doing this, the information is very much out there. Okay, so we already talked about that. The mega backdoor Roth IRA, we actually spoke about already. Again, most people aren't going to be able to do this, but if you are, it's a great way to get more money in tax advantaged accounts. Health savings accounts, the limits are up here. It's not provided by your employer. You actually have to go to a place that provides this, and then based on that, you can choose whatever investments you want based on the provider. So you can look and see what the fees are, because they're all different. The investment options are different, but you get to choose which provider to use for your HSA. But you do need a high deductible healthcare plan for this, for your health insurance, in order to be able to qualify to get an HSA. So for example, here, you actually can't, even with the lowest tier insurance plan, you would not qualify for an HSA. So it really depends on what's available, and whether or not you want to do this would really depend on the healthcare needs of you and your family. Does it make sense to go with a high deductible healthcare plan? If you start an HSA and then your health insurance changes, it's not like the account suddenly goes away. You can maintain it, you're just not allowed to make any further contributions from it. One thing to keep in mind is that there's this thing called required minimum distributions in traditional accounts. So you save taxes on money going in with traditional contributions, but the government wants its share at some point. It wants to make sure that it's going to see that money at some point. And so if you have funds in traditional accounts, you're going to be required at some point to take withdrawals from it so that the government can get the taxes on those withdrawals. That starts at age 72, and it's a steadily increasing percentage that increases per year. The nice thing about Roths and HSAs is that that doesn't occur. So if you have money in Roth accounts, you can basically keep that in there as long as you want without penalty, because you've already paid taxes on the money going in. But for traditional contributions, you're eventually going to be required to pay taxes on that, and to enforce that, that's where RMDs come in. So we've kind of talked about a whole bunch of different accounts here. So that's a lot. It's a lot of information, I know. Most of it is fairly straightforward, like the non-governmental 457B plan I throw in there because it is something that some of you that you're more likely to encounter. But any questions on what we've talked about so far? All right, so either that means that everyone understood everything or, oh, okay. Marginal versus effective rates again. So that's going to be quite a bit. Here we go. So for marginal, so when you make traditional contributions, say again, say you make $250,000 a year. So since we live in a marginal tax system, the first $9,875 you make gets taxed at 10%. Then the money that you make from $9,786 to $40,000 gets taxed at 12%, and so on and so forth. So each bucket of money that you make gets taxed at a different rate. When you make traditional contributions, as I said, if you make 250 and you make a $10,000 traditional contribution, it's as if you made $240,000 a year. But since that 250 to 240 change occurs in this bracket, you actually are saving at a rate of 35%. So you save, when you make traditional contributions, you're saving at your marginal tax rate, not your overall tax rate. Your overall tax rate would be calculated by, okay, I paid X amount of tax here, Y amount of tax here, Z amount of tax here, and so on, and adding that up and dividing it by the total amount that you made, which is going to be far less than the marginal amount, than your marginal tax rate. So with traditional contributions, you save here at whatever your marginal rate is. But when you go to withdraw, so say you withdraw $100,000 from a traditional account, if you saved all of that at 35%, and you then withdraw $100,000 later, the first 10,000 is only going to be taxed at 10. The next 30,000 is going to be taxed at 12%. The next 45,000 will be taxed at 22%. So you saved at a rate of 35%, but you're withdrawing at much lower rates. And again, the overall rate would be how much you actually get and spend, how much you have to pay in taxes across these three brackets, which will be far lower than 35%. And so that's why in your highest earning years, it makes more sense to do traditional contributions. With Roth contributions, you're paying the tax now. So I contribute that 10,000, but I still had to pay a 35% tax on that. And so I'm paying that. And then when I go to withdraw it, I don't have to pay any more taxes on it. So say I'm a resident and I'm in the 22% tax bracket here, it's more likely that, say that your goal spending in retirement is 120,000, then your marginal rate then is going to be 24%. And so it's less likely that you're going to get an advantage from trying to save at the 22% bracket here when you're going to be spending at the 24% at a marginal rate of 24% down the line. If we want to retire before 59 and a half and we don't have a governmental 457B, thoughts on the best way if you have money available, anything better than accepting penalties? So I don't have slides on this. You'd want to look up something called the SEP IRA SEPP, which are substantially equal periodic payments. And basically what it is you roll your money over to an IRA converted to a SEP IRA. And then what that would basically do is say you would be required to take a certain amount of money from that per year until the account runs out. So you'd have to figure out like how much you want to withdraw from that account per year. And you'd be able to do so before 59 and a half without penalty. So there are ways, and there's more than that. There are multiple ways around it, but it gets very complicated and it's sort of out of the scope of this talk, admittedly. All right. So let's go with a brief example here. We're going to say you're working off of you're married, filing jointly, your gross income is $250,000 a year. This was my hope to kind of like go over an example of like how you would estimate take home pay, figure out like how much your financial independence number, and then how much you want to save. This is a nice link to be able to kind of say like, okay, if I know my pay is this and I'm in this part of the country, what's my likely take home pay? But then you could create a plan for how much you're going to save and to which account. And we said you had access to a 401k, so you had 19,500. And if you contributed all of that in a year, you get a 5% match to that. And so you could sort of figure out like how much you would be able to save at least with that. Now, you may say that, okay, well, say that I find out that in order to meet my retirement goals, I have to save more than what I could actually fit into retirement accounts per year, because say you only have a 401k and an IRA, that's 19,500 plus 6,000, which is 25,500. And you're probably going to have to save more than that if you want to retire in a reasonable time frame with a reasonable spending rate. What that means is, then you can save then you save in a taxable account. You just have to accept that you're going to get a tax drag on it, but there's really nowhere else to put that money. That's why people ask about things like the mega backdoor Roth IRA. Is there any way to increase your tax advantage space so that you're not having to put more money in a taxable account? Because there really isn't anywhere else to put it. So where do you put your savings as a resident? The order of operations that I would generally recommend is always have an emergency fund, high interest debt, because you're unlikely to get a return on your investments that's going to be higher than that. You're going to prioritize Roth contributions. So since you don't get a match here, I would say prioritize your IRA, because you can invest in whatever you want. So you have a lot more flexibility there. You don't have to worry about what happens when you change employers. And then if you fill that up, then I would start working on filling your Roth or 403b here. Then at that point, you could start paying down moderate interest debt. Some people might prefer to pay down debt versus make these contributions. These are potentially interchangeable. It really depends on your risk tolerance. Would you prefer to get rid of that debt faster versus potentially taking the risk that you could potentially make more by investing that money now? And then after you fill that up and you pay down moderate interest debt, then if there's nowhere else to put it, you're just going to put it in a regular brokerage or taxable account and invest it there. As an attending, the main differences here are emergency fund, high interest debt parts are still the same, but then the first place you'd want to save money for retirement is going to be a traditional 401k or 403b to the match. So if your employer offers a match, you always want to take advantage of it. If they offer a 50% match for funds going in there, that's a 50% return on the money that you put in there. There is almost no investment in the world. Well, there is no investment in the world that can guarantee you that if you invest in that, you're going to get a 50% return. So you always want to take advantage of any employer match you have available. Then you go and fill your Roth IRA. Again, backdoor Roth probably for most people is an attending because you have the most flexibility. And then once you filled that, then again, the question between paying down debt or funding the rest of your traditional 401k or 403b would be really up to you. If you have 457b plans, if it's non-governmental, do your research. If it's governmental, fill it. And then after you filled all that, you filled all your tax advantage space. Now you're filling a taxable account. So as I said, the things that you can invest in a 401k are really limited by whatever the plan has available. And so say you're dealing with stuff that really sucks. They only have actively managed accounts, or they have passive index funds, but they're charging you like a 1% fee to use them. Because as you saw, like the difference in the long run of investment growth in a tax advantaged account versus a taxable account can be really high. You'd have to be facing really high expense ratios to really say that you're going to start investing in a taxable account and forego your 401k. Even if you had the worst fund choices in the world, I would still contribute to a 401k or 403b that had a match up to maximizing the match at least. You always want to do that almost regardless of the fund choices you have in it. You're going to want to choose the funds with the lowest expense ratios that match your desired allocation, as we kind of reviewed a little bit earlier. You always have one thing that people I don't think take advantage of if their plans suck is just talking to whoever runs your retirement plan. You'll often find that just people haven't looked too hard in it if the plan sucks, and that just no one wanted to take the reins. And so if this is something that you really feel passionate about and you want to maximize, like you often can have a lot of say just by being the only person who has actually cared about it. So always feel like you have the opportunity to improve things if you want. What do you invest in? This is sort of the last talk, but passive index mutual funds, according to your desired allocation of US market, international market, and bond market funds, depending on your risk tolerance. Does it matter where you put the funds? What I mean by this is taxable versus, if you're doing both putting money in taxable accounts versus tax advantaged accounts. which funds you should invest in. The overall effect is really small, but saving enough is really sort of the big thing you need to make sure you're doing. And you could consider the tax efficiency of each fund. I'm really gonna just sort of like glance over this, but in short, stuff like that really spits out a lot of money. So like bond funds that pay dividend, that pay a coupon each year, or stock funds that have high dividend rates, you're going to have to pay taxes on that. So you really don't want that in a taxable account, because there's going to be a larger tax drag, versus things that are not going to be spitting it out, like things like stocks that don't put out dividends, or things that just aren't going to be spitting out stuff that's going to be taxed as income. You might prefer to place in a taxable account if you have to. But again, the overall effect of tax efficient investing is low. The most important thing is just making sure that you're saving enough and have a reasonable investment plan. So what are the take-home points here? And I apologize because I know we're running a little bit over. You need to track your spending and use the force to figure out how much you need to save for retirement, and then use the 4% rule once you've sort of figured out what a reasonable annual spending is, to give yourself a target to try to see if you're going to hit that for retirement, and then develop your plan around that number that you found. Maximize your tax advantaged accounts. You're going to make a lot more money if you investing in tax advantaged accounts than you are in just a regular taxable account, because of all the advantages that you get avoiding taxes. Invest in low cost passive index funds, develop a plan, write it down, and reassess it periodically. Like, it takes a little bit, like the first time you do this, to figure out, okay, what's a reasonable number? What are the assumptions I'm willing to work with? And then what's sort of a reasonable thing that fits into your budget. But once you have that, you implement it, you see how it goes. Does the budget work for you? Are you able to save how much you thought? And then just reassess it over time. The reason I really sort of endorse writing this stuff down is that, things change, the market crashes, people start saying like, oh, it's the end of blah, 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 it's the end of whatever, and like you should completely change things. History really suggests that, like, as long as you're able to staying the course is how you succeed here. Like, selling at the bottom of the market is how you lose money. That's how people in the 2008 and 2000 market crashes lost money. It's the people who held on and continued to invest as the prices went down and did remarkably well, because the market has rebounded and then some, and so they all got to buy stocks at a discount and made tons of money off of that. You just have to be able to weather that storm, and having a plan written down can really give you a reminder saying like, no, this is my plan, this is what I'm going to stick to. All right, and with that, I know we're running over, but I'm happy to stay on and try to answer any questions that you have. But for recording purposes, I'll go ahead and stop here.